Here are two versions of the song Wonderwall by Oasis. Which one sounds better, and more importantly, why? Version 1. And here is version 2. Well, hopefully you thought the second one was better, and in today's video I'm going to explain the 4 reasons why, and how you can instantly upgrade any song on the piano. So let's get into it. The first thing that you can do, and perhaps the biggest difference between those two versions, is register shifting. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the song Hallelujah. Now, usually, for beginners, when they start learning the piano, they'll learn chords in basic triad format. And that is where you play every other key on the piano to form a chord. But that does tend to mean that you play chords in your left hand and a melody in your right hand. And more importantly, that tends to be in the middle of the piano, leaving a lot of empty space on the outside of the piano not being used. So a simple trick you can use in order to make a song sound like it's developing and going somewhere is to switch registers. When something is higher up on the piano, it sounds weaker, and therefore it sounds more thin and spaced out. And when something is lower down on the piano, it tends to sound much thicker. So instead of doing something like this just in the middle of the piano, which is not a bad way of playing it, you could do something like this. Each part of the piano will change the quality of sound of the piece of music. If you play everything in the middle of the piano, then it's all going to sound kind of the same and boring and predictable. Whereas if you play around with playing some parts high, some parts low, some parts in one place on the piano and some parts spread across the piano, then you're going to have more tools to make the song sound interesting and like it's going somewhere. So if you have a set of chords and a melody, try playing the different sections on different parts of the piano to try and create different emotional characters. The second thing that you can do is use inner voice movement. And for this, I'm going to use the song With or Without You by U2. Now, because you typically have chords and a melody in a song, those tend to be the only things that people think about when they're playing. So you'll outline the chords in some way by either playing just the straightforward chords or even arpeggiating them across the piano. But that's all still essentially just the chord. And then you have the melody on top. So you'll end up with something kind of like this. Which once again, there is nothing wrong with. However, in order to make this even better, you can play around with the inner voicing and create various different counter melodies. So this is where you might have some of the chord notes playing some kind of melody in between the actual melody. And you can also harmonize with the melody to make it sound like there's different voices going on. So for example, instead of playing, you could do something like, which has a second voice underneath it. A little bit like if two people were singing and harmonizing together. You can also add counter melodies in between places where the actual melody is not being used, and these don't necessarily need to be full-blown melodic ideas, but it's a chance to play around with the chords and the scale in between what the melody's doing. The best way to practice this is to take the melody out altogether and just play around with the chords and try and improvise around the chords. So in this case, this is just the 4-chord sequence, which is C, G, A minor, and F. So you might just play those chords. And then you can play around with the scale over the top of those chords. And then you can kind of throw that in between what the real melody is. And if you can get really good at those two things, when it comes to playing the melody and the chords, you'll be able to throw in some of your own interesting ideas in between what the melody is doing. The next thing that you can do is use suspensions. Now, a suspension is where you take a chord, and instead of playing the 3 notes that you would usually play, so in the case of C major, that would be C, E, and G, you move the middle note to either the 4th or the 2nd, before then resolving it back to the middle note. By doing this, you are creating some tension in the chord because this feels like it wants to resolve to here, or this feels like it wants to resolve to here. And in Wonderwall, that is exactly what's happening on an A major chord. So A, C sharp, and E becomes A, D, and E, which wants to go to A, C sharp, and E. And you can pretty much do this in any song, especially towards the end of a phrase, if you want to make it feel more satisfying when it resolves at the end. And a good example of this is the song Bridge Over Troubled Water. That sounds something like this. Now, this piece has 2 quite clear suspensions. First, you have this one, which goes from this, where the C is the suspension, drop into the B flat, and then you have immediately afterwards, where you get this chord with the F drop into the E, because that's part of the chord. And you can apply this really to any song. If you were playing a set of chords, let's say F, D minor, A minor, and G, you could add suspensions to any one of these to add just a little bit of tension before resolving it. And that makes the chord sequence sound much more interesting than just those 4 chords by themselves. And if you were to add a melody on top of that, you've pretty much got a song. The 4th thing that you can do is glue your chords together by using voice leading. Now, I've mentioned voice leading many times in various different videos, but this is essentially where you rearrange your chords so that you're only moving by step rather than jumping around. For example, if I have the chords C, G, A minor, F, which is the 4-chord sequence, if I was to play that just as normal chords, C, G, A minor, F, I'm jumping around on the piano. But if instead I rearrange the notes in those chords so that I'm only moving by step, that would be good voice leading. So if I went from C and I wanted to get to a G chord, which is the notes G, B, and D, I can go to B, D, and G because it's the same notes, but I'm only moving by step from C. And you can do the same with all of those chords. So from here, you can go to A minor here, which is C, E, and A, and then to F, here, which is C, F, and A. By doing this, our ear can follow each one of those notes by step, and therefore it's much more satisfying because it's not jumping around. We can hear the 3 different voices kind of moving together. But voice leading doesn't just have to be when you're playing chords like this. It can also be in your arpeggios, if you are playing arpeggios in the left hand and separating the chord notes across the piano. So for example, instead of playing C, E, and G, you might play C, G, C, E, G, C, E, G, C, which is a common left-hand arpeggio that would go underneath any song. Now, instead of playing a C chord like this, and then moving to a G chord like this, which is exactly the same but just moving up 5 notes, to play G, B, and D instead of playing C, E, and G, I can move each one of these notes by step and play a G chord. So, for example, I could go B, G, B, D, G, B, because that means every one of these notes is only moving by step, which makes it much more satisfying to listen to because our ear can hear everything kind of slightly dropping, opposed to where it sounds like we've completely moved everything. So for this, I'm going to use the song Boulevard of Broken Dreams. So here's what it would sound like if I just played, as per usual, the chords in the left hand and a melody in the right hand. Whereas if I only change this so that it has good voice leading in that left hand, and I'm going to change nothing else about the piece of music, it would sound like this. Which, although there is nothing wrong with either of those versions, the second one has much more of a soft motion to it. So here is Wonderwall once again as I played it right at the very beginning, and the upgraded version includes all 4 of these features. Version 1. And here is version 2. In truth, there is nothing wrong with either version of any of the songs I've played in this video, but the more you can expand your toolbox on the piano, the more interesting you can make pieces of music sound. If you want to fix some mistakes in your playing that everyone makes, then head on through and I will see you there.